Welcome to the webinar. My name is Jeff Meredith. I'm an Analyst Relations Manager for Storage at Amazon Web Services, and today we'll be talking about meeting enterprise data resiliency requirements with AWS Data Protection. We're delighted to be joined by two guests today. Brent Ellis is a Senior Analyst at Forrester, where he leads the firm's technology resilience, backup, storage, and mainframe modernization research. Brent helps technology leaders become adaptive, creative, and resilient with modern yet pragmatic approaches. His research spans skill evolutions, full software as a service backup protection, integrated development approaches, optimizing storage for AI, public cloud resilience strategies, and best practices for cloud-native Kubernetes storage and resilience. And today, Brent will be leading a discussion with Nancy Wang, General Manager for AWS Data Protection and Security. Nancy launched the portfolio for Amazon in 2019 and built the business to 500 million plus ARR in under 3 years. She leads an organization of 150 plus in R&D. And today, over 90% of the Fortune 500 are customers of her business, using AWS products to secure and protect their mission-critical applications. Previously, Nancy helped Rubrik launch their first cloud SaaS business and was responsible for their achieving a 4 billion plus valuation in under 2 years. She has also held senior technical roles at Google and management roles in government. Welcome, Brent and Nancy.
All right.
Thanks a lot,
Thanks for
Jeff.
having us.
Yeah. So I, in particular, am excited to have this discussion with you today, Nancy. To set the stage, I thought we would talk about a few key topics, like the trends and evolving customer requirements we're seeing in the world of data resiliency, some of the importance and rising importance of compliance and governance, and then that's effect on the need for centralized management and reporting, giving C-suite visibility around resiliency posture, especially in the world of ransomware. And then looking a little bit, when you start to talk about cloud and hybrid cloud, the shared responsibility for data resiliency, key personas in the organization, that increasing importance of ransomware protection across the business, the rise of security-focused backups and zero trust architecture, and then a little bit about how data resiliency leaders can start to see around the corners and embrace more perspectives from their business. So do you want to get started and talk a little bit more about like the evolving customer requirements?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah,
Sure.
so being part of the centralized AWS data protection team, one of my favorite aspects about the role is how oftentimes customers, when they think about protecting, securing their data, they'll often reach out to my team to discuss what are the best strategies, right? What are some best practices, recommendations for architectural designs that you can provide us? And oftentimes, as I look out across the customers that I have, and today, I can say it's over 90% of Fortune 500 customers and some of the largest enterprise organizations, multinational corporations in the world, is they span many sectors, from healthcare to oil and gas to financial services, because look, data is, what powers businesses these days, and everyone is generating data at a much more accelerated rate than we used to, including the fact, of course, that we have new and evolving data regulations that are all around the world, right? CCPA, we have GDPR in Europe. You have various regulations in country-specific areas as well, like Germany and Mexico, that have certain requirements around keeping data on premises or keeping data in an air-gapped account, for example. So as a customer or enterprise organization that is serving the needs of these multifaceted customers, you yourself also have to be on top of all these regulations and always one step ahead, right, in protecting and securing your data. And that's really where we see our requirements really evolving, is one, due to geo boundaries and what's really happening locally on a regulatory level, and two is the evolving, I want to say, sophistication, right, at some of these events or data breaches that we're seeing out there, right? And so as these ransomware events and actors get more sophisticated, so do your protection mechanisms and how you think about securing your data. And then finally is on the people part. part, right? And people is a big part of my role. And actually, I'm flying next week to speak to one of our largest FinServ customers, is understanding how teams are organized, right? So because security these days is no longer just a part of IT, right? Security is part of everyone's job. And that's why we see today many organizations also changing how they structure their technical organizations, right? Application owners, business developers now also have an important role to play in security.
Yeah. And, just kind of listening to you talk about that a little bit, that hits on multiple parts of a document that I wrote back in July called The 7 Components for Modern Data Resilience. And kind of digging into that, one of the first things I heard is just there's so many more sources of data than there used to be that, traditional backup systems really can't cover it all, especially when you start to get to hybrid cloud, newer workloads in SaaS and Kubernetes and containers. Can you talk a little bit about how AWS is kind of expanding the backup portfolio to really stay in line with businesses' modern needs for data resilience?
Yeah, so to your point, Brent, when we first started, if you think about on-premises data centers, because compute and storage were coupled, if you protected the network, if you protected your compute, well, you were protected, right? So hence EDR solutions. Now, of course, move fast forward to the cloud where everything is decoupled. And that's one of the beauties of the cloud is you can scale endlessly in many different directions, whether it's your networking, your compute, or your storage. And what you end up with is many different types of stateful data platforms, and B, many different, I would say, vectors or paths that someone could get to your data. So on the first part, talking about how we've expanded our scope of protection is if you look at AWS Backup, which is one of the key services in the data protection family, right, is they first started out with protecting 5 key AWS services, right? We had EBS block, storage. We had RDS. We had DynamoDB, EFS, right? Just to name a few. Storage gateway for on-premises volumes. But of course, if you look at the world where customers store data, it's more than just those 5 services, right? So we had a lot of services to keep on going, right? And so our engineering teams have been hard at work, and we've been just really nose to the grindstone and supporting the ever-growing list of more AWS services. So today, I actually want to say it's either 18 or 19, depending on how you count some of the public previews that are coming out. But we cover all of the major storage platforms, block, file, and of course object, S3 being one of our major releases early last year, but also a ton more database offerings, such as, for example, Neptune, Graph, DocDB, for example, of course, in addition to Aurora, RDS, DynamoDB, the OGs, as I call them. But also we've expanded to how we think about, protecting on-premises resources as well, and enterprise applications. So one of the public previews that I mentioned, SAP HANA running on EC2, a major, a memory database that's used by tons of enterprise organizations out there. And of course, who can forget about VMware, right? Where tons of, organizations have large on-premises VMware workloads or footprints, as well as VMware in the cloud or VMware cloud in AWS, right? So if you think about, our ever-extending roadmap into covering more AWS services, more on-premises workloads, more hybrid workloads, that's really where we want to be, right? So if you paint this picture of protection anywhere, that's our motto. We want to be wherever your data is.
Yeah. And, kind of thinking about like a one-stop shop for backup, like if you have an enterprise that is using AWS as their primary cloud, they have a lot of workloads on premise, there's a bigger and bigger need to understand like resiliency across your enterprise tech stack and kind of giving that one place or one pane of glass to see it. And I know that there's a number of ways that at reInvent, AWS was talking about the ability to kind of like see everything in one place and have centralized management from everything from, the backup systems to like security and controls. And, I see AWS putting a lot of work into that. Do you want to kind of touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really in what we call the movement of left shift, right? Left shifting your protection itself. And so even from ISV or startup partners on AWS, where you see many of them coming out with, hey, how can you write secure code, right, from the get-go, so that you're not implementing security best practices or AppSec control measures after your code has been committed or so on and so forth. So likewise, we want a left shift on protection. And part of that comes from, well, understanding what controls are you subject to. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these controls are derivatives of regulatory controls, right? So for example, your data cannot leave such region, or for example, your data cannot be accessed by anyone outside of these roles in an organization. These are just some examples. Well, how do you enforce that, right? In the enforcement mechanism, one, and also two, the ability to prove your protection posture are core parts of what we think about visibility, right? So we start by identifying where are your core data assets. And today, best practices include tagging your data. So something as simple as, well, we have customer records in this RDS database. Well, we can tag it with public records or customer financial records. And so well, this database contains sensitive information. Once you know where that sensitive information or critical data lies within your environment, then as I mentioned previously on the controls aspect, well, how do you want this data protected? And more importantly, on the protection side, how frequent is that protection, right? And protection can be using, as I mentioned, backups, could be, for example, taking replicas, and there are many different options that we offer customers as AWS. And then finally, how do you actually prove, not just, of course, to your board and to your C-level executives, but also to external auditors that your data is actually being protected the way it should be? And those can come in the form of real-time dashboards, can come in the form of API call logs, can come in the form of auditor-ready reports. And so today, with a slew of, for example, AWS Audit Manager, reporting solutions, or the ability to inherit control frameworks from solutions such as Security Hub or creating protection policies using AWS Backup. There are multiple different ways, but all of them lead customers down the path of understanding where your critical data is, being able to map that back to protection schemas or protection controls, and finally, as those protection activities are happening, being able to generate provable reports and auditor-ready reports that your data is being protected.
You brought up the idea of auditors and like their role in compliance, and one of the things the auditor is going to try to do is get you to prove compliance, right? Prove that you meet the regulatory burden that you might have as an enterprise. And it seems to me that for some enterprises, that's a big burden, especially if they're a growing enterprise and they're going into new markets. So it seems that there's some value with working with a large vendor that's already in those markets and already understands the regulations in those markets. Do you guys have a lot of interaction with auditors, kind of figuring out what they need in those reports, how to put them together, and are kind of like you have that steady stream of communication so that you're taking that operational burden off of your customers?
Absolutely. So, and as part of the wide customer base that we have today, which number in the hundreds of thousands of enterprise customers, they also include financial regulators. They also include different regulatory agencies from around the world. One that I can mention that we collaborated with very recently is CMORG, which is a cross-market organizational resiliency group in the UK. And what that is a consortium of various financial institutions and multinational institutions that are based out of the UK. And specifically there, the topic and the theme was immutable data, right? Data bunkers. And so what we created, and these are publicly available as our reference architecture libraries, is the ability to secure your data or your data that's being protected in an encrypted and immutable vault that is not able to be accessed by anyone, not even those with administrator privileges. And of course, that is the currently the highest level of protection that we offer, which means that, look, if your data is being protected and copies are being taken of your primary workloads, well, you can rest assured that no one's going to be able to edit, access, delete that data that's in that bunker vault.
Yeah.
And so, of course, as we work with more regulatory agencies, that will become part of our ever-growing requirements is as regulatory agencies evolve their way of thinking and how they're protecting ever-growing amounts of data, well, so will our reports, so will our audit mechanisms. So, for example, as a companion product, as I mentioned, part of the AWS Audit Manager offering is AWS Backup Audit Manager, right, which allows you to do regular compliance checks as frequently as, let's say, you take your backups, for example, and actually tell you if those backups succeeded, if they failed, what types of resources were they for. So it gives you really, again, that centralized holistic view across all of your accounts, as we recently launched that cross-account, cross-region capability in your enterprise organization of, again, how your data is being protected. And having worked in the U.S. government previously, when earlier in my career, and also for, let's just say, a Big Four, I know firsthand how important it is to generate realistic, accurate, and also timely reports.
Yeah. Speaking about kind of like the reporting and some of the personas involved in backup these days, when I was doing backup, I was an INO. And we got to decide the software we used, where we were putting the backups. We still actually used tape at the time, so like having that trucked off in a truck on a weekly basis or something to Iron Mountain or some other tape vault system. But there weren't really a lot of personas other than INO people dealing with backup. But one thing that I hear from customers nowadays is that product team managers end up being responsible for resilience for their applications. You have risk management leaders that are looking at the risk profile for the business. You have CISOs that are coming in and thinking about the security posture related to backups, as recovery is like that kind of final step in the NIST cybersecurity framework. You just have a lot more voices kind of talking about data resiliency nowadays. How does that come out for you when you're kind of managing AWS backup? Like what does that change for you when you're putting together that solution for your clients?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is the growing community now of user personas who are involved in data protection. So, for example, and having been in the industry as well for most of my career now, right, starting out with backups were an IT admin, right, responsibility, and it was a DBA individual who would pull up your records. Well, now that's completely different, right? Enter the world of cloud and data being generated at a much faster rate than before, right? Data, like I said, is now the cornerstone of many, if not all, businesses today. And what that means is data is a business's, crown jewels. And so from a board perspective, you have organizations like NACD, which is a national board regulatory community, right? Is they mandate these cybersecurity or they mandate these data resiliency conversations. And specifically, the role of the CISO or the CIO has also morphed, right? Very much so, in that they are now one of the, I would say, most visible C-level roles in a company, talking about, how a company is protecting their data, what types of data the company has, and how they're ensuring, for example, that sensitive customer data doesn't get leaked or exfiltrated or ransomed, for example. And quoting, of course, one of the CISOs that we collaborate with quite closely, Lena Smart, who's a CISO for MongoDB, right? One of her top of mind topics from last year is ransomware, right? And as a CISO, it's her responsibility to think about, well, what is the state of data protection within MongoDB, and how can she leverage, for example, cloud native solutions from not just AWS, but also AWS's ISV partners to protect her organization, MongoDB, from ransomware events.
Yep. And when you think about ransomware, so Forrester did a report a few years ago about the four key technologies that we think every backup system should have. An immutable file system, worm-compatible storage, um, you know, advanced anomalous detection systems, and then multi-factor or multi-person authentication, depending on the particular action. And this is just for the backup system. I'm not even talking about production, right? Like if you want to protect your backup system because they end up being a target for ransomware actors, you have to do that for the backup system itself. One of the things that I would add to that is you also need to isolate the risk environment from production. So you don't want the same authentication systems necessarily for your backup administrators as for your production systems, because you don't want their accounts compromised. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like within AWS, how you ensure both that isolation, but that layered defense of your actual backup system, how that gets implemented?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, and I was just, in fact, speaking with a multinational, let's say, auto manufacturer about this a couple months ago, is well, gone are the days where you essentially would give the backup administrator open access to everything, the super, super admin privilege rule, whatever that is, right? That doesn't exist today in cloud, right? You can't just allow access to everything. Even services, for example, and goes back to how AWS thinks about trust boundaries even between its own services. So just to give you a high level kind of rundown of that, right? As an AWS service, AWS Backup is allowed to do certain actions on behalf of customers, right? But we can't do other actions on behalf of customers, such as create or destroy or mutate, right, sensitive data from other accounts. That is not part of the AWS backup remit. And we do that, again, on protection of our customers. So going back to your point around, well, restricted access or specific access based on roles, that's where role-based access is really, front and center in the AWS environment. And specifically there, we are thinking about how to create new ways to allow certain roles or certain users access to only maybe a subset of their backups, for example, right? Or as I mentioned before, in one of our most lockdown vault concepts, or we call it vault lock, which is also in our data bunker vault setup, is not even those with admin privileges now can mutate that data. So what that means is we're adding ever increasing number of safeguard measures to prevent those who don't need access, or for example, malicious actors from accessing your most sensitive data. Because to Brent's point, right, you said, backup systems also need to be protected because look, if you're taking copies, right, or those are backups of your sensitive primary workloads, well, those backups themselves also contain sensitive data, and they also need to be protected at the same level as your primary workloads.
Yep. We talked a little bit about this all through this discussion, but there's definitely an increased role of security within data protection. And I personally think this is, part of operating in the cloud or in a network system, right? Like your boundaries have to get smaller and smaller and closer to the data, and you end up developing zero trust architectures because you can't rely on your building or your network DMARC as the place where you set up your security anymore. And I'm seeing a lot of those improvements come out in the market. You see things like the NIST framework. You see stuff like what you're talking about with regards to how you lock data down, how you isolate risk. But I think another thing that ends up being really important is kind of the security analytics, how you're talking to security systems, how your backup zero trust architecture fits into your enterprise zero trust architecture generally. So if you're able to kind of pivot and talk a little bit about that, that would be great as well.
Sure, of course. So this goes along the lines of where topics such as ransomware or data resiliency have really become board level topics, right? And part of what that means is, again, now backups have also become part of CISO dialogues. In fact, again, going back to the diversification in user personas or the addition of new user personas that we haven't seen before, is a few of actually quite a handful of our large enterprise deals that we've won in the past few quarters have not been actually because the organizations needed a backup system per se, right? But they liked how we built, for example, our least privileged permissions, right? Or they like how we've built our data bunker architecture such that it fits within their security, their data security strategy, or their ransomware protection strategy. And that actually has itself become a conversation starter. So to your point, right, and that's where, in the future, we might see additional collaborations between, for example, AWS security services products like GuardDuty, like Security Hub, and AWS Backup, is because if you think about, okay, if you're, let's say, a SecOps or a security admin, and you're seeing different alerts come up about your sensitive data, well, one of the remediation actions could be, well, if I see, for example, unknown actors in my environment, where are my backups? Are my backups immutable? Can I access them? Can I restore my applications? Right? Because the whole part of zero trust is that, well, if you think of analogy as a medieval castle, for example, well, the invaders are already in your castle, right? So how do you secure your crown jewels or things that are most valuable to you when you already know that you have actors within your perimeter, right? And that goes to, for example, things that we can do on the IAM side, such as right-sizing your roles. These are also goes to things that we can do with for example, firewalls, where certain traffic only comes through firewalls that you've set up within your environment, and of course, making sure that you have regular backups taken of your primary workloads.
Yep. And this is something we didn't talk about before, but it is part of my 7 components. Just the automation and orchestration capabilities that are required today to deal with backups. I mean, if you think of when I was doing backup, I had a one-to-one relationship between what I was backing up and the server, right? Now that server is ephemeral. The data may be in different locations. I may not have a configuration management database where I can line up whether or not I backed up every server. I have to think of things as part of protection groups. I have to label things. I have to tag things. I have to make sure that if a new server is spun up automatically, it automatically gets added to backup policies. If you could talk a little bit about kind of the automation infrastructure that AWS brings to it, because obviously AWS is built around automation. So I expect you have a lot that's going on in the back end to make sure that people are automatically backed up according to the policies that they've set for their data.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite tweets from customers have been, we love AWS Backup because it just works. And that's my favorite line of all time because it just works. And that's really our ethos when we're designing the product. So if I were to categorize the automation, workflows that we've set up, well, one, as you mentioned, tags, right? Tags are best practice because you need to know and categorize what data you have. So all of our, for example, protection policies are tag-based. So if, let's say, you wanted to protect all of your, EC2 instances or databases in EC2 that are tagged, let's say, Department Finance on an hourly schedule, or even as you create net new EC2 instances that have that tag, well, they're going to be picked up by that same policy. So it's not a manual, well, let me remind myself to add this net new resource that I've just created to my existing policy. We'll just pick it up for you. So one, we automate via tags. Number 2 is, again, automation at the application level. So one of my favorite launches that we had at reInvent this past year is around application definition via CloudFormation. So as a customer, I can actually point to a CloudFormation template that I have of my resources that comprise my enterprise applications, point my backup policies to that application definition, and essentially back up all the stateful resources and configuration data within my CloudFormation template. And of course, we're going to continue adding other infrastructure as code recipes to that application definition scope, and again, be able to essentially protect not just stateful stores, but essentially everything that constructs an application. And of course, early adoption numbers are the best way to tell us if something has been successful. And I can say, out of all of the features that we've launched at reInvent, this one had the most uptake. And as of, I would say, week 2, we already had over 5,000 applications being created actually using that feature. So it just shows, again, the momentum and how customers are thinking about protecting their data is no longer, disparate, services or stores, but rather, where are my applications? And that speaks to, again, the new user persona of the application owner entering the data protection dialogue.
Definitely. And it also kind of moves that resiliency discussion to the first step in deploying a new application or building an application, right? Like it kind of shifts that left because, I'll call them the bad old days, right? It's like the application is in production, then you figure out how to back it up and where you're backing it up to. But if that's already part of your CloudFormation template, that's already done for you, right?
Exactly. And in fact, actually, that's really the user persona that I would love to add to the data protection community is a developer themselves, right? As you create your business logic, as you write your applications, set up protection policies as part of that logic, right? And that's really where we see, again, all of this shifting left is no longer a reactive exercise, to your point, Brent, of, hey, here are my applications, here are my workloads, now let's protect them, right? It's as time of creation, you start protecting them. And that, again, leaves you more protected. It gives you, again, the peace of mind and also the assurance that, hey, when something happens or simply when I need to restore for whatever reason, including test dev, for example, purposes, that I have it right there at my fingertips.
You talk about like that's a persona that you want to bring into the fold. Like, let's talk a little bit about where data protection is moving in the future and kind of where this is going to go for AWS. Because, there's AWS Backup, there's Resilience Hub, there's the demands from your actual clients. I'm seeing on my side of things that disaster recovery and resilience is converging with backup and data protection because honestly, what good is your data if you can't actually use it? And that's what the applications are for. So, and then at the C-suite, they just want to know what's my resiliency score. If there's some sort of impact, like what's that going to do to my business? So what sort of investments, what sort of transitions do you think AWS is going to be making in the future to draw in developers, to get more interest from the line of business owners, to be able to kind of give that sort of information to the people that are running the business and really need it?
Yeah. So on the resiliency side, right? As you mentioned, it's definitely a top topic for boards and for folks who are working with data and protecting that data, day in and day out. On the, for example, working with, this whole suite of, different AWS services, AWS managed services, as you mentioned, Application Resiliency Hub. Well, we work actually very closely to that team. And if you look at one of the remediation actions that Resilience Hub provides to customers seeking out the resilience score is, please create backups for your workloads, as I mentioned, right? So it's already being baked in as part of that platform's offerings. Now, as you also mentioned, elastic disaster recovery. Now that's where, coming from the industry, I see it really as two pieces of the same pie, because at the end of the day, right, whether you take copies that are snapshots or file level backups or just simply backups of whatever workloads you might be running versus installing an agent and replicating that data from point A to point B, it's a simple matter of the RPO timescale, right, which is how much data could you stand to lose versus, how much would you like to pay, right? Or the TCO of that equation. And really where, a lot of the solutions architects on my team have with customers is understanding that balance, because we understand, it may not be financially reasonable to have that seconds level replication for all of your workloads. It may be reasonable for a portion of your workloads, and the rest can be, for example, hourly or even daily copies of those workloads. So again, going into someone's environment, each environment is different from the other, understanding, well, what are the fault tolerances or RPO requirements across the board, and presenting that as our best recommendation to our customers.
You brought up something that's also kind of auxiliary to some of the research that I'm doing, which is that there's a cost difference between a really, really aggressive RPO and RTO and one that's a little bit more lax. And cost management is a big deal in cloud generally. Do you currently, or do you plan on having some way of kind of showing the client, if you choose an RPO of 5 seconds versus 15 minutes, what the cost difference will be, so that they can start to align their workloads according to what they can afford for resilience for that application?
Yeah, so today we offer certainly a step in that direction via the AWS BackupTCO Calculator. So if you go online and use, for example, configure your resources, how frequently you want to take those copies, or, for example, retain those copies. Retention is also an important vector in that, because, look, as storage is also consumption pricing based in the cloud, how long you keep your data also factors a large amount into what your end result bill will be. And that is all part of our way to be customer obsessed, right? And really meet customers where they need us to be around cost management, around cost optimization, is giving them that cost visibility into, well, if I want to protect this amount of data at this frequency for this retention rate, maybe I want it locked, etc. What is that going to look like? Also, something to keep in mind is, as you're replicating that data across different regions for either disaster recovery, redundancy, resiliency, also across different accounts for example, ransomware protection purposes, that also then duplicates the amount of data, or multiplies that amount of data that you're attempting to keep around. So that's also going to impact your TCO at the end of the day.
Yep. To kind of wrap up, I also want to pick out another thread that we've talked about a lot, which is different perspectives in technology. And I'll be first to acknowledge that in the IT world, there's a very strong, middle-aged white guy sort of perspective that, hopefully we're getting past, right? Because there's a lot more voices, both in the business and in the business's clients, that need to be addressed. How does that come out within data resiliency? What sort of changes do you see happening? And how do you personally, or how does AWS help those voices rise up so that, we're all resilient together?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so one thing I am fairly proud of, and a theme consistent across my career, is shattering expectations and the representation aspect as well. So, for example, just started down this journey almost 6-7 years ago by starting Advancing Women in Tech, which is now a global nonprofit of close to 40,000 members in, for example, North America, Europe. We've got members in Africa, Asia, you name it. And we're all united around the mission of accelerating more women and underrepresented groups into tech leadership roles, right? Or, for example, encouraging them to be founders and really entrepreneurs. And part of that comes down to, if you're building products for a global and diverse audience, well, you're also going to be needing different diverse builders for that diverse customer audience. And I've even heard this, for example, as part of working at Amazon, is many of our CIOs or CISOs are now women. I mentioned Lena. There's also, for example, Kelly Burns from Accolade Health, the CISO for Twitter, and so on and so forth, all women, and they're also shattering expectations and representation. Right? Is that sometimes they also request that the builders who are sitting across across the table from them also be diverse in representation. So I think as a company of builders, keeping that in mind also comes down to, well, training the next generation, which is why from a data protection perspective, one of the things that my team and I are super proud of is we launched the Data Protection Storage Learning Badge last year. And so anyone can go online and take our courses, learn about all of the different AWS managed services that you and I discussed today, Brent, like AWS Backup, AWS Backup Audit Manager, Elastic Disaster Recovery, right? All of these different services and how they can work together to support your data resiliency and data protection posture, right? Because that really comes from if you continue upskilling yourself and you upskill diverse populations, well, you're ultimately going to end up with a diverse workforce.
And I think one thing that the pandemic taught us over the last few years is that there's a lot more to workplace productivity than what we see in the workplace. There's a lot of unseen work that goes to me being able to go into an office or me being able to be productive or, anyone. How do you think that is changing the way AWS kind of works as well? I mean, do you see changes in the way that work is done at AWS as we kind of transition to, I don't know, more of an anywhere workplace, something that includes more voices, one that's not tied to specific hiring in specific geographies?
Of course. I mean, so from one, even, as we know from our leadership, Amazon is an office-based culture. So that's why for, the teams that I oversee across, Seattle, Vancouver, and also the San Francisco Bay Area, we also encourage our employees to come in at least one day a week. And I do think that's important for just in-person, real-time collaboration, because I don't know about you, but if I had to Slack someone who was multiple hours of time zone difference away about something and then wait another couple hours for them to get back to me, I think that would really drag out the ideation process. So that's why we encourage in-person, creation, creative time, brainstorming. With that said, that we also want to the point about representation and more diverse voices, we understand that employees have different demands on their time, whether it's taking care of kids or taking care of elderly, or simply they also have their own needs that they might need to see to during the day. So with that said, the balance of days in the office, days remote gives our employees that flexibility. Plus, with that said, taking the Amazon, leadership principle of deliver results, ultimately it's really about the results that you're delivering, not how many hours you're in the seat, for example, or online, or I see your green dot. That's really not the management philosophy that we espouse here. It's really about how did you move the needle? How did you delight customers today, right? What did you accomplish? What was your impact? Right. And so those are the mechanisms and actually the metrics that I would prefer to index on.
So thinking about, the kind of like the delivery, what's the outcome? Like you've obviously run AWS Backup for a few years now. What's the outcome? Like, what do you see for this product? Like, is it doing everything you wanted it to do on day one?
Well, as someone who always wants more, I've been told that's my personality. No, with that said, we can always do more and do more for our customers. But what I have seen, and I'm quite proud of the team for their accomplishment, is really the evolution and the trajectory of the business, right? And so today you heard me talk a lot about data protection, data resiliency, not just backups. And that's really important because that really shows kind of the evolution of how we're thinking about data protection that's on AWS. Because sure, we started out with our core product, which is AWS Backup in 2019. And then in 2021, we introduced its companion product around auditing, compliance, risk management. And in the future, what I can, kind of share and tease excitement for is if you think about everything that we talked today around, well, data security being a bigger topic in the boardroom among our customers, well, eventually that is also a direction that we're looking to move into, because today security and protection really come hand in hand, because protection is an action, is an output of how you stay secure.
Awesome. I think we're kind of through the list of talking points right now. Is there anything you wanted to add or any questions you wanted to point my way? I've made you talk a lot during this, so.
No worries, Brent. Well, I think it's really interesting to just hear from your perspective, right? As you, I'm sure, also talk to other cloud providers and also other ISVs in this area. Is what do you see as maybe top of mind? Three things top of mind for folks in this area, and then two, where do you see our biggest area of untapped opportunity?
So I definitely think that ransomware is still top of mind for almost everybody. It continues to evolve. It continues to change. It's moved from a strict encryption process to an exfiltration process, trying to get the data out, saying, I have your data. The attackers are becoming more sophisticated, more automated. They're taking advantage of all the same technologies that the backup people and the defenders are taking advantage of, right? They have their own little funding schema, a little black market of venture capitalists that are paying people to develop ways to exploit businesses. So I think that's not going to go away anytime soon. That being said, I think it pushes the market to take a lot of those protections and cross the line between traditional backup systems and production level resiliency. So I think we're going to start kind of evolving how we think of data protection as part of a life cycle, and not just there's production data and there's backup data. And we're going to think of governance across that life cycle. We're going to think about security across that life cycle. And we will see kind of more pressure on businesses to think of their data that way. I think it will also kind of force a unified view of data management between what we see on the data analytics and insights and kind of structured data world and the unstructured data world of file servers and what messages that are in chat systems and email, because right now those two worlds don't really talk much to each other, and businesses don't have a unified view of data management. So I would expect that to start to converge as you start to think of your data assets within the business as a singular thing, and how do you govern all of it. That means there's a lot of work to be done. It means that it also is a lot of opportunity to think of this in a strategic way. Backups in the past were not a strategic decision. They were purely an operational decision. And the security context, ransomware, using data in hybrid and cloud-based environments has forced it into a strategic decision-making perspective. I think as you start to think of unified data and you think about data lifecycle management and you think about data as a corporate asset, then it becomes a more strategic decision. The same way you would think about a new factory, right? You have to think about a return on that asset and how you manage it over its life cycle. So I think that's the long game of where we're going. Don't think that's happening in the next 1 to 2 years, but I think eventually. With regards to the exfiltration thing, I think that's something the market's going to have to deal with sooner rather than later. Right now we have systems that can tell you when data's leaving. We have systems that can try to lock down connections where data is being exfiltrated from, but that's really kind of a limiting blast radius sort of response. And I think we probably need to evolve into a data is always encrypted, and we can kind of set off a little time bomb to destroy the data if it leaves our environment. So I don't know if that means forgive the term blockchain, it's used everywhere, right? But if you have something that has a programmatic response on the data, something that can trigger a response when it moves outside of a particular context, like your enterprise or a valid context to run, that it gets destroyed. I mean, we do this reactively right now with devices using like device management systems where we can like wipe a device remotely. Finding some way to do that specifically around data is probably something we need to develop as a capability in the not so distant future in order to kind of deal with the effects of ransomware. So, I mean, those are some of the things that are top of mind for me that I don't necessarily have answers for, but just kind of looking into the future of how do we respond to some of the threats that are out there.
Got it. And so kind of my takeaway from what you just mentioned, Brent, is really kind of these pieces, right? Or, defense in depth pieces, or, the centralized visualization of data across its life, right? Or the life journey. It's really just coming together, right? And that goes back to some of the topics that we talked about a little bit earlier around automation, or how can you make it just simple for customers to do something. So thank you for that insightful just instruction on what you see coming up, because hey, that's what my team is loves to do, which is take an idea and put it into reality.
Hey, I love the people that can make ideas into reality. I just get to talk about ideas. So
well, that's why we work great together.
Yep. Well, thanks a lot, Nancy.